Well, it's been a while since we have been together on our journey, our Jewish journey through the book of Acts, called Acts Facts. We had a few holidays that interrupted, so let's refresh our memories. Let's re-immerse ourselves as we re-engage with the text. Let's ask ourselves previously what occurred in Acts Facts. Well, you'll remember that we began chapter 12 of the book of Acts, a very interesting, I think dynamic and really a funny, humorous chapter as well. Doesn't sound humorous at all at the beginning, but we see humor later. Now at that time, Herod, the king, this is Herod Agrippa, nephew of Antipas. But Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James, shockingly, he had James, the brother of John, one of the 12 apostles, one of the original 12, put to death with a sword, had him beheaded. This is a bust of Herod Agrippa. And it's important to know your Herods. So if I ever ask you or challenge you to a game of know your Herods, right? We know, of course, Herod the Great, the beginning of the gospel story. That is followed toward the end of the gospel story with Herod Antipas, who is the son of Herod the Great. Then we see in the book of Acts, Herod Agrippa, who is the grandson of Herod the Great, but not the son of Antipas. He is the son of Aristobulus, another son of Herod. And later on in the book of Acts, many moons from now and chapters ahead, we will meet Herod Agrippa the second, who is the son of Agrippa and the great-grandson of Herod the Great. So, know your Herods. Which Herod was this? Which Herod was this? Herod Agrippa, thank you. Right, good. Okay. You can play along at home too if you like. When he saw that it pleased the Jews, it's a real crowd pleaser executing James. He proceeded to arrest Peter as well. Can knock out 2 of the original 12, of the big 12. 1/6 would be done. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. That was one of the periods when the population of Jerusalem would have swelled up as pilgrims traveled from all over the land and all over the region and the world to celebrate the holiday in the central location of worship. So this would have been a really big crowd pleaser, and Herod wanted to make sure that he ingratiated himself with his people. When Herod, had seized him, he put him, Peter, in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. So 16 soldiers rotating around the clock, 2 on either side of him and 2 outside one on either side of him and 2 outside the cell. 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. Big crowds were guaranteed. Well, here Peter was thrown into the Huskau, otherwise known back then as the Antonia Fortress, just adjacent to the temple. And the night prior to the execution, the scheduled execution of Peter, an angel comes and executes, see what I did there? The escape of Peter. And Peter, in the middle of the night, is able to escape through the gate of the Antonia and makes his way through the narrow cobblestone streets of the city of Jerusalem, making his way to the home of Mary, the mother of John Mark, most likely, where they're holding a prayer vigil for Peter's release and protection. When Peter actually shows up, it is quite some time before those who are praying for his release believe that God actually had come through and that he really had been released. And finally, at long last, they invite him into the safety of their home's courtyard. Motioning to them, verse 17 now, see we're moving really quickly in review. Motioning to them with his hand to be silent. It's Jewish people talk with their hands. He described to them how the Lord had led him out of prison. And he said, report these things to James, not the James who was executed, James the brother of Yeshua, right? This is Yaakov, the brother of Yeshua, who is the one of the letter of James fame, and the one who's in charge of the church in Jerusalem after the apostles had dispersed. And of course, Peter then left Jerusalem and went to another place. He spends the remainder of his ministry, of his life, traveling the great centers of Jewish populace throughout the Roman Empire, spending time in Babylon and other places, eventually to Antioch and then eventually to Rome. This is the last, aside from a cameo appearance that we'll see him in chapter 15 in just a few weeks, this is the last time that we see Peter in the book of Acts. Well, the next morning, Herod was excited to be able to execute the most popular, the leader of the apostolic band, the leader of the church. But there was no one in his cell. And when Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away. Now the words to execution, not in the original text, but that's the only led away that any guards are ever taken. Led away, not to a big fabulous vacation, but no, to execution, because they had blown you had one job, right? One job! And they couldn't keep this guy in his cell, even though they were chained to him. Well, then Herod went down from Judea to Caesarea. Remember, he was only in Judea. He didn't live in Judea. He was in Judea for the holiday. And then he went to Caesarea, where he had a magnificent palace. He had a palace in Jerusalem as well, but he had a magnificent palace in Caesarea, and it was on the sea as well. He was spending time there. This is beautiful downtown Caesarea Maritima, called so because it is a great seaport. We've talked about Caesarea Maritima before when we were introduced to Cornelius, who lived there, the first Gentile believer. And we see a artist's reconstruction of what Caesarea looked like at the time. You'll see down in the bottom center, there is a theater. You'll see in the top left corner the fabulous and famous seaport. And you'll see just adjacent to that, you see the palace of Herod jutting out into the sea. This is what it looks like today. Those of you who have visited Caesarea with me, you remember the theater we saw. We went down to Herod's palace, which is literally jutting out to the sea. And then we saw the oblong hippodrome, which is just down the block and adjacent to the palace. Most likely, the events that we're about to read about occurred in the theater. Josephus tells us that it occurred in the theater, although there are some who place the events that we're going to discuss in the hippodrome because of the direction of the sun shining, which you'll understand in just a moment. So either the theater, still there, same theater, or the hippodrome, still there, same hippodrome, just a little bit less of it than there was 2,000 years ago, where the events that we're about to read occurred. Verse 20. Now he, Herod Agrippa, know your Herods, was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. Why? Doesn't tell us. Unknown reason. Politics. Does a king need real reason to be angry? Some political offense, of course. Now, Tyre and Sidon, two of the neighboring nation of Phoenicia's major cities. So where Lebanon is today, these are where Tyre and Sidon or Sidon were, just north of Israel, right on the Mediterranean coastline. And what happened was King Herod Agrippa shrewdly embargoed their supply of Israel's food exports. If you're familiar with the northern heart of Israel, of the area between the Galilee and Judea, bordering Samaria, it's the bread basket, it still is the bread basket of Israel, area just south part of the Galilee, and leading up there. And so then, the region was dependent on Israel to export food, bread, right? With one accord, they came to him. I don't know how they all fit in one accord, but there they came, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, and this is like his aide-de-camp, his personal assistant, they were asking for peace. They're suing for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. If there was no wheat sent from the heartland of Israel, there would be no bread to be eaten in Phoenicia. So they sued for peace. Now, Rome had granted Herod Agrippa extraordinary power, had extraordinary delegated power from Caesar, his friends, Claudius. One would not have wanted to be on Agrippa's bad side for very long. And so, battered into submission, very hungry, worried likely about the first possible indications of famine, they needed access to the bread basket of Israel, and they sent ambassadors and a huge delegation to sue for peace, having also enlisted Blastus, the close personal associate of Agrippa. Probably, if we read through between the lines there, having won over, probably through bribery. What happens in Tyre stays in Tyre. While this happens to be one minor political squabble that no historical document corroborates, there's excellent historical verification in the manner in which the squabble was resolved. Let's read on. So here we are in the summer of 44 AD, on a day of festivities that was ostensibly to honor the Roman Emperor Claudius. The citizens of Phoenicia, of the cities Tyre and Sidon, as well as the citizens of Caesarea, were assembled together in the magnificent theater of the city. On the appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering address to them. The people kept crying out, "The voice of a God and not a man." Now, he sat down. Now, here we are in the theater, and he's going to be addressing the people in the theater. Conversely, if it's in the hippodrome, where the chariots, like in Ben-Hur, where the chariots go around, would have been on a platform like this. People sat to make their orations in those days, in contrast to our contemporary practice. And so Agrippa ascended to the platform and began to speak. But so powerful was his speech. The people, such sycophants. Well, what do you do when you've got a powerful ruler? The crowd reacted not with the normal political praise and cheers, but with worship. And they erupted into the chant of the sound, another voice. Herod Agrippa's voice is not the voice of a man. He possesses the voice of a God. Now, evidently, Herod Agrippa's response to the worship of the crowd was not quite along the lines of Peter's when Cornelius bowed down to him and Peter said, Yech, in Hebrew. Now, the voice of a God and not a man. What is a ruler to do when the people begin to worship and they begin to attribute that which belongs only to God to their ruler? What is a ruler to do when, for whatever reason, the people, whatever the motive of the people, they begin to unquestioningly worship the man in charge? Josephus helpfully tells us, we have this parallel passage in the Antiquities of the Jews, 19.8.2. This is described in some detail, and it parallels Luke's description to a T. Agrippa, Josephus writes, came to the city Caesarea. There he exhibited shows in honor of Caesarea. Upon his being informed that there was a certain festival celebrated to make vows for his safety. Now, on the second day of these shows, on the second day of these tributes, he put on a garment made holy. Agrippa, no, you're Herod's. Put on a garment made wholly of silver and of a contexture truly wonderful, and came into the theater early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, shone out after a surprising manner, and was so resplendent as to spread a horror over those that looked intently upon him. In other words, Herod began to glow in the sun, wearing, of course, this beautiful silver glittery garment, silver lame, whatever it was, right? Maybe he thought he was going to be in a Broadway show. Anyway, either way, he begins to glow. You can imagine the impression it would have made on the crowd. Dressed to impress, I always say, right? And presently his flatterers cried out, one from one place and another from another, although not crying out for his good, as it turns out, for a parenthetical expression, that he was a god. And they added, be thou merciful to us. For although we have hitherto reverenced thee only as a man, O king, yet shall we henceforth own thee as superior to mortal nature. In other words, as Luke quotes, the voice of a God, not a man. Upon this, the king did not rebuke them, nor reject their impious flattery. Oh, please, stop. Oh, please, none of that. He simply absorbed it. As politicians drunk with their own power maybe want to do. Upon this, the king did neither rebuke them nor reject their impious flattery, And all of a sudden, a severe pain also arose in his belly and began in a most violent manner. His pain was become violent. Accordingly, he was carried into the palace, out of the theater, into the palace. And when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life, being in the 54th year of his age and in the 7th year of his reign. And that is the end of Herod Agrippa. We will see in just a moment that Luke describes this moment again the same way, telescoping it down in brevity, because the book is not a book of Acts, it's not a book about Herod, but about the apostles and about the early church. But we do actually, from Josephus, we have just a little bit of insight as to what manner of ruler he was and his economic policies. The revenues that he received was he liked to tax. He was a big taxer. The revenues he received was very great, no less than 12 millions of drachma. And that, my friends, is a lot of drachma. But what did he do? Was he fiscally responsible? No. Yet, even though he taxed his people excessively, yet did he borrow great sums from others. So tax and spend was our Herod Agrippa. For why? Josephus tells us, for he was so very liberal. And his expenses exceeded his incomes, although I'm sure that, and of course, I don't talk politics. I'm not that kind of person. But I'm sure that 3.5 trillion would exceed even his imagination. But anyway, he was very liberal. His expenses exceeded his incomes. And his generosity was boundless. So he taxed his people and shared it, redistributing the wealth, one might say, money that was not his own, that he shared for his own pleasure. A very generous, it's always great to be generous with other people's money. Well, anyway, Herod's life caught up with him, and we return to the book of Acts immediately. An angel of the Lord, Josephus left out that detail. It was unknown to him, but known to Luke. Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. So God reacted with swift judgment to Agrippa's acceptance of the crowd's flattery. And so there on the podium, sitting there delivering his address, he doubles over with intestinal distress and is carried out of the theater dying. And he lingered agonizingly on his deathbed for 5 days. And he finally dies. And Dr. Luke, the physician, tells you what the problem was. He gives his diagnosis. Diagnosis from Dr. Luke was that Agrippa was eaten by 10 to 16-inch long intestinal roundworms, which feed on intestinal fluids, causing, well, a lot of detail I'll leave out, but it's not a very pleasant way to go. It's a rather gruesome way, but not an atypical way, sadly, to die in the ancient world. The moral of the story is that assailing God's apostles, it's never recommended, even for a king. And upon Agrippa's untimely death at the age of 54, you would think his kingdom would pass to his son. Know your Herods. What is his son's name? Agrippa II, right? No, the kingdom doesn't pass to Agrippa II. Claudius, the Roman emperor, once again appoints a Roman procurator over Israel. Let's talk about this brief passage. It's easy to pass over it, easy to have a morbid chuckle over the details that Josephus gives us. But Herod Agrippa, who was appointed, again, friend of Claudius, appointed by Caesar himself, spent quite a bit of time growing up in Rome, in the royal household. When he was appointed king, he held absolute power over his subjects. However, this king of Judea chose to position himself as an enemy of God. How so? By arresting and planning the execution of God's people, specifically James and Peter. To that we can add, attributing to himself glory which belongs only to God. When powerful rulers of nations or states or territories overstep their delegated authority, positioning themselves as enemies of God's people by acting contrary to the preservation and protection of said God's people, it often does not end well for those rulers, sooner or later. Sometimes fast judgment, sometimes it takes a while. However, until such time that God intervenes to provide relief, his people, like the church in the book of Acts, his people may be forced to endure periods of suffering and persecution. Each generation of the church should prepare itself for these periods and never be taken by surprise by how suddenly they arrive. In no nation throughout history has the church ever been exempt from suffering tyrannical rulers and their delegated toadies abusing their authority. Up until this point, our nation would be the exception that proves the rule. Things may be turning suddenly. Now, we must be ready. Because drunk with power, these tyrants zealously work to diminish humanity's divinely granted freedom or crush their liberty. In so doing, they always position themselves as enemies of God. I'm talking theology, not politics. But God is not mocked. For whatever a man or a government sows, he also reaps, as Paul reminds us. Well, that's very convicting. Well, with the death of Herod and the termination of the threat facing the Jerusalem leadership, relief is granted. The mother church in Jerusalem once again had a chance to breathe and to thrive. And for the next 3 years, from 44 to 47 AD, conditions in Jerusalem are going to be conducive to the numerical and spiritual growth of the church. Look at the next verse right after the death of Agrippa. But even though James had been executed, even though Peter almost was executed, God intervened. But the word of the Lord, even though the church had been persecuted, and many had had to go into hiding, but the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied. Now, during these same 3 years, from 44 to 47 that we're talking about now, jumping from the death of Agrippa, the next 3 years, and these great spiritual growth conditions during these same 3 years, You'll remember back in Acts 11, we met Agabus, the prophet, and he predicted that famine and hunger would shake the church to the core. And providentially, what must have been their most dire hour, to the rescue comes our friends Barnabas and Saul. Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. Well, the mission's already over. What happened in 24 and a half? What happened between 24 and 25, right? You'll remember Acts 11. I told you Acts 11 is out of place chronologically. It's thematically listed there so that we can finish up the story right now for a time being of Paul and Barnabas, and then we'll get back to them later. So here's the link, okay? We had ended chapter 11 around the year 47, and now we end chapter 12 at that same point. We jump back to the same points, and you remember Acts 11:29, and in the proportion that any of the disciples from Antioch had means, each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea. And this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. And so now they delivered their gift, making their way from Antioch, passing by Phoenicia, and made their way to Jerusalem. Let's not do that right now. And so, let's go back to that last verse there, because that's going to set us up for the rest of our time. Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they fulfilled their message, taking with them. They pick up now, on their way back from Jerusalem. While they're in Jerusalem, they pick up John Mark. We were introduced to John Mark briefly last time. And John is going to serve as their assistant in the future and is going to be a major player. And he eventually, of course, is going to write the gospel that bears his name. So what's happening here? How does this all fit in? This is a period of time, according to reconciling with Galatians, and Paul's description there. This is a period of time, second time that Paul comes to Jerusalem, and this is the time when he brought Titus with him, and the apostles who were still there at the time were able to solidify his ministry and give him the imprimatur of the Jerusalem leadership. So we now get to the end of the second portion of the book of Acts, the second major division in the book of Acts. If we look at the chronology, and I'm not asking anybody to read the tiny print here. For those of you who really want to read what's here, buy my book. Because it's in there. But we see that from May of 33, we saw Christ's ascension. We saw Pentecost also in May 33. Peter and John being arrested in the summer of 33. Acts 3, the apostles arrested. Acts 5, 34 AD. The deacons of chapter 6, Stephen and company, appointed in the winter of 35 AD, the death of Stephen. In the spring of 35 AD, the Samaritans coming to faith in the summer of 35, Saul's commission occurring that same summer, 35, Saul's Damascus ministry taking from 35, 36, and 37, Saul returning for the first time to Jerusalem, being sent to Tarsus in the fall of 37, Peter meeting Cornelius in 40 AD, Paul winding up in Antioch, previous chapter, 42 AD, the death of the Apostle James, the death of also of Herod Agrippa, which we saw this week, 44 AD, and Saul and Barnabas, top line, in Jerusalem, fall 47 AD. Well, the next thing on the chronology is the first missionary journey beginning in chapter 13, which is where we're going to pick up next time. Before we end this second major division. There's three major divisions in the book of Acts. Right? There's Acts 1 through 8, and then we have Acts 8 through 12, And then we have the second half of the book, which really deals with reaching the nations. That begins in chapter 13. We see the mission center in these first portions were Jerusalem. The next section that we will begin on next week, the mission center is going to be Antioch. We see the principal apostle up to this point has been our friend Peter, with an introduction to Paul. But from this point on, even though we'll see a cameo from Peter, chapter 15, Paul is going to serve as the principal apostle. The demographic that we are reaching in the first part of the book, of course, were the Jews, solely and completely, exclusively Jews. We moved to the second part of the book of Acts, and we saw Jews and Samaritans and Gentiles. The Samaritans are regionally locked into that area, so we move past them in the third portion of the book to reaching both Jews and Gentiles. The Acts 1:8, you remember that Yeshua directed the Jewish people, his apostles, you'll be my witnesses and you'll receive power, and you'll be my witnesses first in Jerusalem, beginning in Jerusalem, and then in Judea and Samaria, and eventually to the ends of the earth. We have seen Jerusalem as the mission locale, Judea and Samaria, and the second part, which we are concluding today. And starting next week, we will continue through the end of the book to be reaching to the ends of the earth. We have traversed about 14 and a half years of the church's history, the early church's history from 33 to 47 AD. About 14 and a half years. And wouldn't you know that the third portion, and really the second half of the book, is going to take us another 14 and a half years to the end of the book of Acts. So I want you to buckle your seatbelts, because we make a right turn, not at Albuquerque, but we make a right turn, actually looking north. It's a left turn at Antioch, and we're about to enter into the Roman Empire beyond the borders of Israel. And, well, things do get exciting in chapters to come. So do not miss it. Stay tuned. If you want to read ahead, we will be in chapter 13, first half of 13, next week. All right.